Do you believe that true love is built on life's hardest struggles? The storm raged outside like a ferocious animal, sending gusts of wind that whipped the trees and shook the signs of businesses along the street. Raindrops as thick as small stones bounced off the Manhattan sidewalks, forming puddles that glistened in the yellow streetlights. Cars sped by, spraying water over their sides and leaving a trail of horns and flashing headlights in the fog. The city that never slept now seemed to shrink under the weight of that stormy night. Inside Bean and Hearth, the atmosphere was a warm, welcoming haven, an almost surreal contrast to the chaos outside. The exposed brick walls in warm terracotta tones and the lamps hanging from copper wires created a play of shadows that made the space feel even more intimate. The air was filled with the rich aroma of freshly ground coffee, a faint hint of cinnamon, and the sweet, buttery smell of the cookies Ava had baked hours before. Ava Bennett, the cafe's owner, moved with the precision of someone who knew every inch of the space. Wearing a cream sweater with the sleeves pulled up to her elbows, she wiped the wooden counter with circular motions, while her light brown hair, tied into a messy bun, let small strands fall across her face. A discreet stain of flour still decorated her cheek, the result of her morning's work, but she was so immersed in the flow of the night that she didn't notice. The regulars were there, spread out across the tables, holding their mugs as they chatted in low tones that blended with the soft, instrumental music playing in the background. Ava offered a warm smile to Mr. Wilson, a regular customer who thanked him for the cappuccino with a kind gesture. But before I could say anything else, the cafe's door was opened abruptly, bringing a gust of wind and rain that almost blotted out the heat in the room. The bell above the door tinkled violently, echoing through the space. A tall, imposing figure hurriedly entered, almost as if fleeing the storm itself. The man seemed like a force of nature. His black suit was completely soaked, his shoulders broad and the wet fabric clinging to his athletic body. He shook his dark hair almost impatiently, sending small drops of water onto the floor and onto the entrance, while his blue eyes scanned the room. There was a presence about him that effortlessly dominated the space, but was accompanied by a tense, almost aggressive energy. When he walked up to the counter, every movement seemed calculated, with firm steps that made the surrounding customers look away. Ava felt a shiver run down her spine, not from the cold, but from the intensity that emanated from it. "Excuse me?" His voice was deep, hoarse, filled with an impatience that seemed directed at the entire universe. Ava froze for a moment, her eyes fixed on him as he drummed his long, steady fingers on the counter. The light from the cafe captured small details, the subtle glow of a luxury watch on his wrist and the sculpted features of his face, as if they had been handcrafted by a perfectionist artist. "Can anyone help me?" he asked again, his irritation now evident. The silence that took over the cafe seemed overwhelming. All eyes were on him. Ava felt the weight of the collective attention and, in almost automatic movement, recovered, wiping her hands on her apron. "Welcome to Bean and Hearth," she began, her voice sounding more polite than her mood allowed. "We have a simple rule here. We respect the queue." The man raised an eyebrow, as if trying to decide if she was being bold or just defiant. He looked at the line of customers in front of him, then back at Ava. "I'll pay double," he said, without even blinking. "I just need a double espresso quick." Ava felt heat rise to her cheeks. It wasn't just his condescending attitude that bothered her, but the way he seemed to be used to getting what he wanted effortlessly. She crossed her arms, straightening her posture as she faced him. "This isn't about money," he replied, with a smile that bordered on sarcasm. "It's about respect for other people." The man tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing with something that looked like a mix of irritation and amusement. After a few tense seconds, he let out an exasperated sigh, turned around and went to the back of the line. Ava let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The man was a walking storm, arrogant, imposing, and undeniably attractive, but in a way that made her blood boil. As he returned to work, his eyes betrayed his determination and cast a furtive glance in his direction. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, looking at the menu on the wall with an expression that was a mixture of boredom and frustration. When her turn finally came, Ava was prepared to maintain her composure. "A double espresso?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. "That's right, and if possible, hot and fast this time," he replied, without looking up from his cell phone. While preparing the order, Ava discreetly observed him. There was something about him beyond obvious arrogance. He felt weighed down, as if something heavier than his wet suit was pressing down on him. When she placed the glass on the counter, he took it without thanking her and began heading for the door. But then he stopped, turning slightly on his heel. "Do you have an umbrella?" he asked, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Ava frowned. "We don't sell umbrellas. I didn't ask if they sell them." He pointed to a black umbrella leaning in a corner near the entrance. "I'll take that one." Before Ava could protest, he already had the umbrella in his hand, opening the door. "Hey," she exclaimed, her voice louder than she intended. "Are you going to return this, or is this just polite theft?" He stopped in the doorway, turning slightly towards her. His blue eyes were brighter in the soft coffee light, and there was a crooked smile on his lips that seemed to tease and irritate at the same time. "Consider a loan. I'll pay you back." And with that, he disappeared into the rain, letting the door close with a soft bang. Ava stood still for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. When he returned to the counter, he found something left there. A small business card. "Tyson Cooper, CEO, Knockout Industries." Ava read the words once, twice, the name echoing in her mind. She knew who he was. Who didn't know? But having him in her cafe, so unbearably arrogant, was a meeting she hadn't expected. Putting the card in her apron pocket, Ava felt something strange. Irritation mixed with an unsettling curiosity. Something about the man was impossible to ignore, and she had a nagging feeling that this wouldn't be their last meeting. The rain had stopped the next morning, but the air still carried the fresh, earthy smell that came with the storm. The streets of Manhattan glistened in the sunlight, as if the city had undergone a purification. But for Ava, it felt the opposite. Inside bean and hearth, the welcoming warmth and comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee couldn't calm the restlessness that gripped her. Behind the counter, Ava held a sheet of paper in her hands. The real estate conglomerate's second formal notice was there. It's cream paper with fancy edges, but carrying a merciless message. The proposal was clear. They wanted to buy the building to transform it into another one of those modern skyscrapers that swallowed up the essence of the neighborhood. The amount offered was substantial, enough to settle all of the cafe's debts and still leave a considerable margin. But Ava knew that accepting meant erasing the last connection she had with her mother. She ran a hand through her light brown hair, which was loose and fell over her shoulders. The strands were a graceful disorder, a reflection of sleepless nights. Her golden brown eyes were fixed on the sheet, but she could barely make out the words. In his mind, images of his mother appeared. Her smile when she opened the coffee for the first time, the way her fingers delicately touched the coffee beans, as if they were jewels. Bean and hearth was their dream, built with love and perseverance before cancer tore them apart 5 years ago. Ava sighed deeply and placed the paper on the counter, feeling the weight of responsibilities tighten in her chest. Even with the constant movement in the cafe, the sound of cups being placed on plates, the hiss of the espresso machine, the voices of regulars, she felt like she was isolated in a bubble of uncertainty. "Ava?" called Molly, one of the baristas, in a hesitant tone. Ava looked up, as if she had been pulled back to reality. Molly was young, with blonde hair tied in a ponytail and a face always lit by a gentle smile. But at that moment, there was concern evident in her eyes. "Everything is fine?" Molly asked, holding a tray with 2 artfully decorated lattes. Ava forced a smile, but it barely reached her eyes. "I am, yes. Just overthinking, as always." Molly nodded slowly, but she didn't look convinced. She knew Ava carried more than she let on, but she chose not to pressure her and got back to work. Ava barely had time to process her own thoughts when the bell above the door rang, its clear jingling piercing the room. Instinctively, she looked up, and her breath hitched for a moment. There he was. Tyson Cooper entered the cafe with the same confident air she remembered, but this time without the traces of the storm. His light gray suit looked tailored, with the fabric highlighting his broad shoulders and impeccable posture. He exuded sophistication and brute strength. a combination that seemed to dominate him as much as it dominated the space around him. Soft sunlight streamed through the windows and reflected off her perfectly styled dark hair. His blue eyes were even more piercing in the daylight, like two deep oceans. But there was something in them that Ava noticed immediately, a restlessness that seemed hidden beneath the controlled facade. He walked up to the counter with steady steps, and Ava tried to keep her expression neutral, although she could feel her heart speeding up involuntarily. "I didn't bring the umbrella back," he said, with a small smile on the corner of his lips, as if confessing to a small crime. Ava crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly as she assessed him. "I noticed," she replied, in a dry tone, "but at least it brought your ego back." Tyson let out a short, hoarse laugh that seemed to come out unintentionally, as if it wasn't something he did often. "I deserve this." He rested his forearms on the counter, leaning slightly, his proximity making Ava smell a faint scent of something woody, mixed with a fresh touch of cologne. "Actually, I came for something else. If you're going to borrow something again, I think you should start leaving guarantees," she replied, raising an eyebrow. "Nothing like that." He raised an eyebrow, almost challenging. "I want a coffee." "Just that." Ava blinked, trying to decipher the mix of charm and provocation that he seemed to convey in every word. "And how will you want it? Double espresso, like last time?" "No, surprise me." There was a challenging tone to those words that made Ava narrow her eyes, still staring at him. Without saying anything else, she began to prepare a simple but impeccably made latte. Her hands moved expertly, and she finished with a delicate foam art that formed a leaf on top of the drink. "Here you go," she said, placing the cup in front of him with a firm touch. Tyson picked up the cup, took the first sip and stopped for a moment. His eyes lifted to meet hers, and there was genuine surprise in his expression. "Impressive. Didn't you imagine it would be good?" she replied, maintaining her composure, but feeling the heat rising in her cheeks. "I imagined it, but it exceeded my expectations." He finished his coffee slowly, as if savoring each sip, while Ava glanced at him, trying to understand the reason for his visit. It certainly wasn't just the coffee. There was something about him that made her suspicious, as if every word, every gesture, had a hidden purpose. When he finally placed the cup back on the counter, Ava decided to confront him. "You don't seem like the type to frequent small cafes like this." Tyson shrugged, his gaze calm. "Small businesses interest me. There's something about them that big corporations can never replicate. Authenticity." Ava narrowed her eyes, her suspicion intensifying. "I hope that's not a euphemism for buying places like mine and turning them into soulless conglomerates." There was a moment of tense silence. Tyson looked at her with an attention that seemed to invade her thoughts, his blue eyes narrowing slightly. "I didn't come here for that." Despite his firm tone, Ava couldn't decide whether to believe him. "Okay, Tyson Cooper," she said finally, "but if I find out you're plotting something against Bean and Hearth, no matter how big your ego or your bank account, I'll find a way to take you down." He laughed again, and this time there was something softer in his expression. "I don't doubt it." When Tyson left the cafe, Ava noticed that her heart was beating faster than it should. She didn't know why he had come back, but something about him seemed to pull her into a world she didn't fully understand, and that intrigued her deeply. The next morning dawned with the sky covered in heavy clouds, as if the previous week's storm was still hanging over the city. The autumn cold was beginning to intensify, bringing with it an icy wind that seemed to cut the face of anyone who dared to face it. Inside Bean and Hearth, the warmth and aroma of fresh coffee created a welcoming contrast to the gloom outside. Ava Bennett was at the counter, checking out the day's orders. The notebook she used to write down supplier details was worn, with some pages folded and small coffee stains on the edges. It was another one of those mornings when the weight of decisions and responsibilities seemed like a constant shadow on your shoulders. Since the eviction notice, his mind was in a constant struggle between preserving the cafe and giving in to pressure from the real estate conglomerate. As she concentrated, the cafe's door opened, and the bell above it tinkled softly. Ava automatically looked up, expecting to see one of the regulars, but her eyes fell again on the imposing figure of Tyson Cooper. He was wearing a gray overcoat that looked too expensive for an ordinary day. His dark hair was perfectly combed, and there was something about the way he walked that exuded self-confidence without being ostentatious. He stood at the counter, his blue eyes studying Ava with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see something beyond what she showed. "Good morning," he said, with a restrained smile that seemed as calculated as it was genuine. Ava tilted her head suspiciously. "Don't you get tired of showing up here? I like good coffee, and apparently, I like good challenges too." She let out a short laugh, but there was a hint of curiosity in her tone. Tyson looked different that first time. There was still a trace of arrogance about him, but now it was accompanied by something else: determination, perhaps even interest. "What brings you here today?" Ava asked, resting her hands on the counter, waiting for the next sentence with the same suspicion of someone who's about to negotiate with the devil. He took a card out of his wallet and placed it on the counter. It wasn't like the card from last time, but a small leaflet branded with his company. Ava took the paper and read it quickly. "Do you want to use my coffee for an advertising campaign?" she said, looking up at him in disbelief. Tyson smiled, but there was something more serious in his expression. "Exactly. My company is launching a new line of sportswear. We want something that speaks to the public in an authentic way, different from traditional commercials. Bean and Hearth has that authenticity. It's the perfect place." Ava held the paper for a moment, as if it weighed more than it should. His mind began to work quickly, analyzing the implications. An advertising campaign would bring visibility to the cafe, perhaps even more customers. That could help her buy time, perhaps enough to find a solution that didn't involve selling the building. But Ava also knew that allowing something like this could compromise everything she had built. Bean and Hearth wasn't just a cafe. It was an extension of his soul, a living memory of his mother. The idea of letting him be used as a backdrop for a large corporation made her feel uncomfortable. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said finally, handing the leaflet back. Tyson didn't move. He seemed to expect that answer, but he didn't seem willing to give up. "Before you say no outright, listen to what I have to offer." Ava sighed. There was something about the way he spoke, so confident and direct, that made it hard to ignore. "I'm listening. I don't want to change anything about your coffee. In fact, I want to show the place exactly as it is. This is part of our strategy, highlighting the real, the genuine. I will not interfere with the essence of Bean and Hearth. Plus, you'll receive a fair percentage for the use of the space, and we can even create a partnership that benefits the cafe in the long run." She crossed her arms, watching him warily. He spoke with a conviction that seemed almost disarming. "What if I say I don't trust you? Then I'd say you don't need to trust me," he replied, without missing a beat. "Trust the terms you can establish yourself." Ava frowned. It was an unexpected answer. Would I set the rules? Absolutely. There was a moment of silence between them. The air seemed charged with an almost palpable tension. Ava knew that accepting that proposal meant opening a door to something bigger, but it also meant taking a step that could save her cafe. "Okay," she said finally, reluctantly, "but I have some conditions." Tyson's smile grew a little, but he quickly suppressed it, maintaining his composure. "Say no large equipment that destroys space, no changes to the decor, and no disturbing my customers. Closed. And one more thing." Ava leaned forward slightly, her expression serious. "If at any point I feel like you're trying to turn Bean and Hearth into something it's not, the deal ends immediately." Tyson nodded slowly, as if he was processing her every word carefully. "It seems fair." They shook hands, sealing the deal. Tyson's hand was warm, firm, but Ava felt a kind of electricity in the touch, something that made her pull her hand back a little too quickly. In the days that followed, the cafe became the stage for the campaign's production team. Ava watched everything with watchful eyes, making sure that none of the rules she had imposed were broken. Tyson was present for almost every day of filming, closely supervising every detail, but in a way that didn't feel overbearing. There was something intriguing about the way he carried himself. Despite his serious and professional demeanor, there were moments when he seemed to relax, like when he praised the coffee or chatted casually with Molly about the peculiarities of the menu. Ava, in turn, began to notice details about Tyson that had previously gone unnoticed. He had a peculiar way of frowning slightly when he was concentrating, and his eyes seemed to carry a depth that contrasted with the superficial, arrogant CEO image she had initially formed. During a break in filming, Tyson approached the counter where Ava was rearranging some cups. "You're nervous," he said, not as an accusation, but as an observation. She stopped, looking at him for a moment before returning to what she was doing. "And how do you know that?" "Because you clean your cups obsessively when you're worried." Ava looked up at him in surprise. "You've been paying too much attention." "Perhaps. Or maybe I just have an eye for detail." There was a charged silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Ava felt the weight of Tyson's gaze on her, but this time, she didn't seem to judge, seemed to try to understand. When the campaign ended, Ava found herself feeling something unexpected, relief mixed with a hint of longing. During the filming days, she had gotten to know a side of Tyson that was less corporate and more human. He irritated her, yes, but he also intrigued her in a way she couldn't ignore. Tyson, in turn, left the cafe with a feeling he hadn't felt in years. There was something about Bean and Hearth, something about Ava, that made him want to come back. The sky over Manhattan was tinged with a dull gray, as if reflecting Ava's mood as she adjusted the cafe chairs that morning. Bean and Hearth seemed different these days, as if the walls and wooden floors held more stories than she cared to admit. The marketing campaign had ended, but Tyson continued to appear frequently. He said he liked the coffee, but Ava suspected there was more to his constant visits. She saw him enter the door before she even heard the sound of the bell. Tyson always had a presence that seemed to command the space, as if all eyes naturally gravitated towards him. He wore a black leather jacket over a casual shirt and jeans, a surprisingly simple combination for someone accustomed to business attire. His blue eyes swept the room before landing on Ava. He gave a slight smile, almost as if he was waiting for her to send him away again. But Ava just shook her head and continued to organize the glasses on the counter. "Don't you get tired of showing up?" she said, without looking directly at him. "The coffee is good, and the service." Tyson stopped talking, leaning on the counter as if he wanted to tease her. "Well, let's just say it's unique." Ava rolled her eyes but couldn't hold back a small smile. Tyson always seemed to know how to put her in an uncomfortable state, as if he was carefully disarming the defenses she had built up over the years. "If you're going to stay here again, at least order something," Ava said, finally looking at him. "Latte, like last time," he replied as he sat down at one of the tables near the window. The morning passed at a slower pace, but Ava noticed that Tyson looked different that day. He was playing with his cell phone absently, but something in his posture gave him away. He was tense. His shoulders were slightly hunched forward, as if carrying an invisible weight. When the movement slowed down, Ava took Tyson's cup and approached the table. He looked at her curiously, saying nothing as she placed the coffee in front of him. "You look uncomfortable," she commented, crossing her arms as she watched him. Tyson let out a short laugh, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Are you in the habit of analyzing everyone?" "Only when someone is sitting in my coffee shop, looking like they lost a fight." Tyson looked up, clearly taken aback by the reference. For an instant, something passed through his eyes, a shadow, perhaps, or a memory. He looked outside, at the movement of the leaves dancing in the wind outside, before turning his attention back to her. "Old habits leave marks," he said finally. Ava narrowed her eyes, intrigued. Tyson never talked much about his past, and she respected that. But something about that answer left her with the feeling that there was much more to the man than he let on. Later, while organizing inventory in the small storage room behind the cafe, Ava heard heavy footsteps approaching. She turned around and saw Tyson standing in the doorway. "In need of help?" he asked with a tone that sounded more like a sincere offer than a provocation. "I didn't know CEOs had time to carry boxes. I didn't know that cafe owners had problems with help." Ava laughed softly and pointed to a pile of boxes in the corner. Tyson entered the warehouse and began carrying one of the larger boxes, but she soon noticed him making a discreet grimace as he moved his right shoulder. "What was that?" Ava asked, approaching. "Nothing else." She narrowed her eyes, ignoring his attempt to minimize the discomfort. "Let me guess. Old injury? Tyson hesitated for a moment before nodding. Right shoulder. I moved a few times when I was still fighting. It's nothing serious. It just bothers you from time to time. It sounds like more than no big deal, Ava said, crossing her arms. Why don't you deal with it? Tyson shrugged, and she almost laughed at the irony. Standing still has never been my strong suit. Ava watched him for a moment, seeing the man who seemed so invincible admit something that made him vulnerable. It was a different view of Tyson, and it made her see him in a new light. Over the next few days, Tyson kept showing up at the cafe, offering help with minor repairs or simply hanging around. Ava began to realize that he was different than she initially imagined. Behind the confident facade and quick responses was a man who carried not only the physical weight of his injuries, but also something deeper, something he didn't share easily. One night after closing, Tyson was still at the cafe. He was sitting at one of the tables, watching Ava as she cleaned the counter. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it carried a tension that seemed to grow every day. "Why do you keep coming here?" she asked, finally breaking the silence. Tyson looked at her, and for a moment, he seemed to be carefully considering his response. "Because it's real." Ava stopped, not knowing how to respond. "What? This place? You?" He leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "The world I live in is full of things that seem important, but deep down, they don't mean anything. Here, everything is different. You are different." Ava's heart skipped a beat, but she tried to ignore the feeling. "That sounds like a rehearsed speech." "Perhaps." He smiled, but there was a sincerity in his eyes that she couldn't ignore. Ava didn't respond. Instead, she went back to cleaning the counter, trying to ignore the turmoil his words had caused inside her. Later, when Tyson finally got up to leave, he stopped in the doorway and looked at her over his shoulder. "You know you don't have to carry everything alone, right?" Ava frowned, but before she could respond, he was already gone, leaving her alone with her thoughts. That night, as she closed the cafe, Ava felt something different. There was an energy in the air, something that seemed to pull her towards Tyson, even though she tried to resist. He made her feel vulnerable, but at the same time, he seemed to offer strength she didn't know she needed. Tyson, in turn, walked through the streets of Manhattan feeling a different weight on his shoulders. It wasn't the physical pain that bothered him, but the realization that for the first time in a long time, he wanted to be something more than just a CEO or an ex-wrestler. He wanted to be someone Ava could trust, even if she didn't know how to do that yet. It was a quiet day at Bean and Hearth, more so than usual for a fall morning. Outside, the city moved along at its hurried pace, but inside the air seemed calmer, filled only by the soft sound of ambient music and the occasional clink of cups being placed on the counter. Ava was focused on lining up the new bags of artisanal coffee that had arrived that week. The fresh aroma of roasting beans filled the space, bringing a sense of familiarity that calmed his nerves whenever something beyond his control tried to invade his mind. The morning passed slowly until the sound of the bell on the door caught his attention. Tyson entered, as always, with a presence that seemed larger than himself. He was wearing a dark wool coat, and his expression was more closed than usual. His blue-gray eyes were shadowed, as if the previous night hadn't been kind to him. Ava couldn't help but be curious. Tyson always looked so composed, as if every step, word, and gesture were meticulously planned. But that day, there was something different about him. A restlessness, perhaps even a fatigue, that he made no effort to hide. "Looks like someone had a long night," Ava commented, handing him the latte he already knew he was going to order. Tyson gave a half smile, but didn't respond immediately. He picked up the cup, brought it to his lips, and took a sip before answering. Not all nights are made for rest. There was something in his tone that made Ava hesitate. She knew she shouldn't press, but her curiosity was almost palpable. Tyson was an enigma that she was barely beginning to decipher, and every time he blurted out something more personal, it was as if a piece of the puzzle appeared unexpectedly. While Ava was organizing some orders at the counter, a new figure entered the cafe. The man was thin and wore a suit that looked like he had bought it in a hurry. His eyes were alert, almost predatory, as they swept the space. When he spotted Tyson, his face lit up with something that looked more like opportunism than friendship. Tyson Cooper, called the man, walking towards him with a wide smile that didn't reach his eyes. Ava, still behind the counter, immediately became alert. Tyson froze for a brief moment before looking up at the man. His body seemed to have become stiffer, as if he was preparing for an invisible blow. "I didn't think I'd find you here," the man continued, sitting uninvited in the chair opposite Tyson. "And I didn't expect to be found," Tyson replied, his voice low and controlled, but with a sharp tone that Ava had never heard before. Ava pretended to be busy with the cups, but she couldn't help but pay attention. The interaction between the two was full of tension, as if there was an ancient story that neither of them wanted to revisit, but were forced to face. "I'm doing a story on former sports icons," said the man, leaning back in his chair as if he had all the time in the world. "People who made history, but then disappeared from the radar. You would be a perfect addition to the series." Tyson didn't respond right away. His eyes were fixed on the man, but there was something in his gaze that seemed distant, as if he were remembering something he would rather forget. "I'm not interested in interviews," he said finally, his voice cold as the wind outside. "Come on, Tyson. Audiences would love to know what really happened in that final fight. You were the favorite, the undefeated champion, and then, well, you know." The silence that followed was so heavy that Ava could almost hear it. She didn't know what the man was talking about, but she could feel the impact of his words on Tyson. His shoulders were tense, and his jaw felt clenched. "I already said I'm not interested," Tyson repeated, this time more firmly. The man smiled, but there was something cruel in his expression. "Everyone has something to say, Tyson. Even silences speak." With that, he got up and left, leaving behind a cloud of tension that seemed to fill the entire cafe. Ava was silent, watching Tyson as he remained still for a long moment. Finally, he stood up and walked towards the counter. "Who was that?" Ava asked, trying to keep her tone casual, but her curiosity showed. Tyson looked at her for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "A reporter. I realized that, but he seemed to know a lot about you." Tyson sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "They always know too much, and they never know enough." There was silence between them. Ava could sense there was something more, something Tyson wasn't saying, but she also knew this wasn't the time to pressure him. "It's not easy to leave the past behind, is it?" she said finally, her voice soft. Tyson looked up at her, and for a moment, he looked surprised. "No, it's not." The tone in his voice made Ava feel her chest tighten. She didn't know exactly what he was carrying, but she knew it was something that hurt him deeply, even if he would never admit it. In the days that followed, Ava noticed that Tyson was more reserved than usual. He still came to the cafe, but his energy felt different, like something was pulling him down. She wanted to ask more about what had happened, but she felt like he needed space. One night, while closing the cafe, Ava saw Tyson sitting alone at one of the tables. He seemed lost in thought, looking at a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. "Are you still here?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Tyson looked up but said nothing for a moment. Finally, he gave a small smile, but there was no humor in it. "It's a good place to think." Ava sat across from him, crossing her arms on the table. "Do you want to talk about it?" Tyson laughed softly, but the sound was bitter. "There's not much to say, just enough to complicate things. Then tell me enough." He looked at her, and Ava could see the internal battle in his eyes. Finally, he sighed, as if he was tired of carrying the weight alone. "I was young, invincible, or at least I thought it was. At the height of my career, I accepted a fight that was too big to turn down. It was the fight that was supposed to cement my name as a boxing legend. But there were problems behind the scenes, bets, manipulations, people who wanted to ensure the outcome was favorable to them, not me." Ava held her breath, feeling the pain in Tyson's words. "I didn't play their game. I didn't accept losing. But in the end, they took me out of the ring anyway. They tarnished my name, spread rumors, and I was left with nothing." There was a long silence between them. Ava didn't know what to say. She had never imagined that Tyson carried such a heavy burden. "That's not fair," she said finally, her voice full of emotion. "The boxing world is rarely fair." Ava reached out her hand, placing it over his. It was a simple but meaningful gesture. Tyson looked at her, and something in his expression changed. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. That night, as Ava closed the cafe, she realized that she saw Tyson differently now. He wasn't just the arrogant CEO who had walked into his cafe during a thunderstorm. He was a man who had fallen and gotten up, even when the world seemed determined to keep him down. Night had fallen over Manhattan, and the cold November wind made the Bean and Hearth's windows shiver gently. Outside, the streets sparkled with the reflection of car lights. But the cafe was empty except for Ava, who sat at one of the tables in the far corner, her arms crossed on the wood and her face hidden between them. The characteristic smell of coffee still hung in the air, mixed with the sweet and subtle aroma of cinnamon coming from the counter. But to Ava, the room seemed devoid of its usual warmth. Everything around her seemed to echo an emptiness that she felt intensely within herself. The paper was on the table, slightly crumpled from how much she had squeezed it in her hands before throwing it there. The cold, impersonal words of the eviction notice still burned in her mind, each sentence written with a cruel indifference that made her stomach turn. It was official. She had 30 days to leave the building or face legal action. Ava's eyes were red and swollen. She didn't cry easily, but this situation was different. Coffee wasn't just a business for her. It was the materialization of years of dreams, hard work, and most of all, memories. Her mother always said that Bean and Hearth would be a place where people could find a little comfort, where life would slow down enough for them to remember the simple good things. Losing the cafe was more than losing income or physical space. It was like losing your mother all over again. The cafe door opened, and the bell tinkled almost hesitantly. Ava didn't look up, assuming that maybe Molly or another employee had forgotten something. But the footsteps that echoed on the wooden floor were different. Heavy but careful. Tyson stopped at the entrance and watched for a moment. The soft light from the pendant lamps illuminated Ava almost wistfully. She looked small and vulnerable, completely different from the stubborn, determined woman he knew. He could feel the weight in the air, something thick and sad that seemed to fill the space between them. "Ava?" he called, his voice low, almost a whisper. She lifted her head slowly, her eyes glistening with tears that she didn't bother hiding. When she saw him, she tried to compose herself, quickly wiping her face with the back of her hands. "Tyson, what are you doing here?" "I could ask the same thing," he said, approaching. "Everything is fine?" Ava tried to smile, but failed miserably. "Just a rough day." He looked at her, then at the crumpled paper on the table. Without asking permission, he sat down on the chair in front of him and took the document. He read it quickly, his eyes narrowing as he understood what was happening. "Eviction?" he asked, returning the paper to the table. She nodded, looking down as if she couldn't face him. "They want the building to build another one of those commercial complexes. They've been pressuring me for months, but now it seems like there's no way out." Tyson was silent for a moment, watching her. He had seen people under pressure before, but there was something about Ava that made him uneasy. She seemed to be carrying the weight of the world alone, and it bothered him more than he cared to admit. "It's not fair," he said finally. "This place means so much to you." Ava laughed, but it was a bitter, humorless sound. "Fair? When did the world care about what is fair?" She looked at him, and for an instant, Tyson saw something deeper in her eyes. It wasn't just sadness. It was an old pain, a wound she had carried for a long time. "My mother and I opened this cafe together," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "She always said that Bean and Hearth would be our refuge, a place where people could feel at home, even if it was just for a few minutes. When she got sick, we still spent hours here, planning, dreaming. Even on the worst days, it gave us hope." Tyson listened silently, without interrupting her. He saw how she pressed her hands together on the table, as if she was trying to hold back the memories before they escaped. "After she died, I thought about giving up. Everything felt empty without her. But then I realized that if I let the coffee die too, it would be like losing the last part of her that was still with me." She stopped, taking a deep breath to control the tears that threatened to fall again. "And now they want to take that too." Tyson felt a tightness in his chest. He knew what it was like to lose something that defined who you were, what it was like to fight against forces that seemed invincible. "Ava," he began, but stopped, not knowing exactly what to say. He wanted to help her, but he knew Ava wasn't the type of person who would accept help easily. "Don't worry," she said, trying to smile again. "I will find a way." I always find it. But there was something in his voice that didn't convince. Not even her. Tyson reached his hand across the table, covering hers. Ava looked at him, surprised by the gesture. His hand was warm and firm, and for a moment, she felt as if a small part of the weight on her shoulders had been lifted. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice low but full of determination. Ava opened her mouth to protest, but he cut her off. "I know you are strong. I know you are capable of facing this, but that doesn't mean you have to carry everything alone." Tyson's words hit her in a way she hadn't expected. For years, she had learned to fend for herself, not to depend on anyone. But now, sitting across from him, feeling the warmth of his hand on hers, Ava realized that maybe, just maybe, she didn't need to be so strong all the time. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They were silent for a moment, just looking at each other. There was something in the air, a silent connection that didn't need words. Tyson knew that Ava was still far from accepting his help completely, but he was determined to be by her side, even if it was just to make sure she didn't face this alone. When he finally got up to leave, Ava walked him to the door. The cold wind blew inside when he opened the door, but for the first time that night, Ava felt a warmth that didn't come from the cafe. "Good evening, Ava," Tyson said, looking at her with a small smile before leaving. Ava closed the door behind him and stood there for a moment, looking out at the empty street. Something inside her had changed that night. She was still scared, she was still lost, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe she wasn't as alone as she thought. The night at the Bean and Hearth seemed endless, enveloped in a melancholy tranquility that contrasted with the hectic activity of the day. The clock on the wall read almost midnight, and the soft lights of the cafe cast long, warm shadows across the wooden floor. The air was warm, filled with the lingering aroma of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the faint citrus scent of the soap used on the damp towels Ava used to clean the tables. Ava Bennett, with fatigue etched into her shoulders, moved around the space with the precision of someone who knew every corner of the cafe. She was wearing a thick burgundy sweater, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, and her ponytail was slightly disheveled after hours of work. Her movements were automatic, but there was a deliberate care in each gesture, as if this were more than a routine. It was a ritual of preserving what Bean and Hearth meant to her. At the table by the window, Tyson Cooper sat, silently watching her. He had arrived at the end of the day, with the excuse that he was just passing through. But Ava knew it wasn't that simple. He wore a dark wool coat, partially open, revealing a well-fitting gray shirt that highlighted his broad shoulders and imposing posture. The way he leaned back in his chair, with one arm thrown casually over the back, seemed carefree. But his blue eyes fixed on Ava told another story. He was attentive, almost studying her, and the intensity of his gaze made her feel strangely exposed. "You're not exactly the kind of person I imagined cleaning tables," Ava commented, breaking the silence as she wiped down the counter for the third time that night. His voice had a hint of teasing, but it also carried an attempt to ignore the slight nervousness she felt in his presence. Tyson arched an eyebrow and let out a smile, the kind of smile he seemed calculated to elicit. "And you're not the kind of person I imagine accepting help. It seems like we are both defying expectations." Ava paused for a moment, looking at him with a look that mixed exasperation and curiosity. "Perhaps, but I still think you're here for some reason you're not telling me." Tyson leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His smile deepened, but there was something in his eyes, a spark of sincerity, that Ava hadn't expected. "Maybe I just like the coffee, or the company." She felt her face heat up at the response and quickly looked away, focusing on adjusting a row of cups on the counter. There was something in his tone of voice that seemed to tease her without being intrusive. She was used to dealing with pushy customers, but Tyson was like no one she had ever encountered. "If you like coffee that much, you should take the opportunity to learn how to close the place," she replied, trying to regain control of the conversation. Tyson laughed, a low, husky laugh that seemed genuine, almost carefree. "Is this an invitation?" Ava rolled her eyes but couldn't help but give a small smile before tossing him a clean cloth and pointing to the yet-to-be-cleaned tables. "If you're going to stay, at least be useful." He obeyed with surprising precision, picking up the cloth and wiping the tables with calculated, efficient movements. Ava glanced over as she organized things on the counter. His presence seemed to fill the space in a strange way, as if he was not just there, but as if he belonged somehow. As the night progressed, the cafe became increasingly quiet, but the stillness was not uncomfortable. There was something almost intimate about that moment, something Ava couldn't explain. Tyson worked in silence, but she could feel his occasional attention on her, which made her question whether the silence was really a blessing or a curse. When they were done, Ava walked to the door and turned the key, hearing the final click with a sigh of relief. When she turned around, she found Tyson standing in the middle of the cafe, his hands in his coat pockets, watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately decipher. "Ready, mission accomplished," she said, trying to ease the tension with a casual tone. Tyson took a step towards him, his shoes making a soft sound against the wooden floor. He was close enough that Ava noticed the soft golden glow of the lamps reflecting in his eyes, making the blue even more intense. "Do you do this every night?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper, as if he feared breaking the stillness of the moment. Ava nodded, trying to ignore the way her heart seemed to beat a little faster. "It's part of the job. Someone has to make sure everything is in order for tomorrow." He tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing as he studied her. "It looks lonely." Ava blinked, surprised by the observation. His words had an unexpected weight, something that touched a point she wouldn't admit even to herself. "Sometimes," he admitted, his voice barely audible. The air between them seemed to grow thicker, and the silence that followed was filled with palpable tension. Tyson took another step forward, and Ava felt his proximity like an electric current. His eyes were fixed on hers, and there was something in that look that seemed to see her in a way that no one else did. "Ava," he began, his voice softer now as if he was hesitating. She looked up at him, feeling as if time had stopped. The cafe seemed to be enveloped in a bubble where nothing else existed but the two of them. Tyson raised a hand, moving it slowly, but before he could touch her face, the loud sound of knocking on the door made them both jump. Ava turned quickly, her heart racing, as Tyson took a step back, frowning. On the other side of the glass, an older man stood, knocking hurriedly and gesturing. "We are closed," Ava shouted, her voice louder than necessary, trying to cover the sound of what she felt. The man continued to insist, and Ava, exasperated, walked to the door to open it. "Sorry to bother you, but I really need a coffee. It's to keep me awake at work," she sighed, feeling the weight of tiredness. "Okay, but just this once." As she prepared coffee, she felt Tyson behind her, quiet but present. The moment they had shared, that brief instant suspended in time, seemed to have fallen apart with the interruption. When the man finally left, Ava locked the door again, this time more tightly. "I think that ends the night," she said, without looking at Tyson. He nodded, but his voice was lower than before when he responded. "Good evening, Ava." When he left, Ava stood still for a moment, staring at the closed door. His mind was in chaos. She knew something had changed that night, but she didn't know exactly how to deal with it. On the way home, Tyson couldn't shake the thought of Ava. There was something about her that attracted him in a way he couldn't explain. Something that made every night at the Bean and Hearth seem harder to forget. The morning at Bean and Hearth started slowly, with the first rays of the autumn sun streaming through the windows and painting the room in soft shades of gold. The wooden tables reflected the light, and small vases with yellow flowers added a touch of discreet joy to the space. The familiar aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the sweet, buttery smell of the apple pies Ava had prepared early, creating a welcoming atmosphere that contrasted with the hustle and bustle of Manhattan outside. Ava stood behind the counter, eyes fixed on a list of supplies as she gripped a pen tightly. Despite the comforting smell and the soft instrumental music playing in the background, she felt a growing uneasiness. The deadline given by the real estate conglomerate was approaching, and the pressure to find a solution made his mind spin tirelessly. The sleepless nights were beginning to show on her face, small dark circles under her eyes and a paleness that not even the discreet blush she wore could hide. She had just finished serving a cappuccino to a regular customer when the doorbell rang. Ava didn't need to look to know who had entered. The air seemed to change when Tyson Cooper was present, filling the space with an energy that no one else had. When he finally looked up, there he was, standing there as if he were part of an impeccable painting. Tyson wore a dark suit, the impeccable cut highlighting his athletic figure. His hair was perfectly combed, and his dark tie complemented the deep blue of his eyes. Despite his polished appearance, there was something about his posture, the slight tense of his shoulders, the way his hands were tucked into his pockets, that suggested an invisible weight. "Good morning, Ava," he said, his voice low and serious, but filled with something she couldn't immediately identify. She tried to smile, but the gesture was mechanical, without genuine warmth. "Tyson, what brings you here so early? We need to talk." The serious tone of his words made Ava drop the tray she was holding. He didn't seem like he was there for a coffee or a casual conversation. Something in his expression, that fixed, determined gaze, made her feel a pang of worry. "All good. Let's go to a table." They sat at one of the tables near the window, where the sunlight highlighted the wood grains. Ava crossed her arms over her chest, as if trying to create a physical barrier between them, hoping that would help her maintain control. "I'm listening," she said, trying to sound firm but unable to completely hide her curiosity. Tyson took a deep breath, his dark blue eyes fixed on hers as he seemed to choose his words carefully. "I want to buy the cafe building." The silence that followed was so heavy that Ava could almost hear it. For a moment, she lay still, blinking slowly, as if trying to confirm that she had heard correctly. "What?" he finally asked, disbelief written all over his face. "I can buy the building. Take the real estate conglomerate out of the picture. This way, you won't have to worry about eviction or anything else." Ava's heart raced, but not in the way he probably expected. A wave of conflicting emotions hit her hard: surprise, anger, and a twinge of frustration. "Do you think you can just solve everything with money?" she asked, her voice rising a little higher than she intended. Tyson frowned, clearly taken aback by the intensity of his reaction. "It's not that, Ava. I just want to help." She let out a short but bitter laugh, as if laughter was an outlet for what she really felt. "To help? That's no help, Tyson. This is control." The words hit Tyson like a blow. He sat back in his chair, crossing his arms as his expression fell. "Control? Is that what you think?" Ava leaned forward, her frustration pouring into every word. "What else should I think? You show up here with this absurd proposal, thinking you can buy my independence, my work, as if it were just another business." "It's not just another business," Tyson interrupted, his voice firmer now. "It's your coffee, the place you built with your mother. You said he means everything to you. I'm trying to protect you." "Protect him or protect me," Ava countered, her gaze penetrating his with an intensity she didn't know she possessed. For a moment, Tyson didn't respond. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but closed it again. There was a conflict evident in his eyes, an internal battle that he seemed to be fighting. "You don't understand, Tyson. This cafe is more than bricks and wood. It's the last thing that connects me to my mother. If I accept your help, if I let you buy it, then what it means to me disappears." "That's pride talking," he replied, his voice low, but with a hint of frustration that he couldn't hide. "Maybe it is, but it's my pride, my decision." The air between them felt electrified, the tension so palpable Ava could almost feel it on her skin. Tyson watched her for a long moment, his eyes filled with emotions he seemed to be struggling to hide. Finally, he shook his head, as if giving up trying to convince her. He stood up slowly, the chair squeaking lightly against the wooden floor. "You're being irrational, Ava." She stood up too, her arms still crossed, her posture rigid and defensive. "And you're being a controller who thinks everything can be solved with money." The words came out before she could stop herself, and as soon as she said them, she saw Tyson's expression change. He looked hurt, more than angry, as if those words had reached something deeper than she intended. "Maybe you're right," he said finally. "Maybe I'm trying to control things, but it's not for the reason you think." Ava was silent, unable to respond. There was something about the vulnerability she saw in him in that moment that disarmed her, but his stubbornness wouldn't let her back down. Tyson looked at her for a few more seconds before turning and leaving. The sound of the door closing echoed through the empty cafe, leaving a void behind. Ava sat down again, resting her elbows on the table and holding her head in her hands. She knew she had been hard on him, but she also knew she couldn't accept the proposal. As untenable as the situation seemed, she needed to find a solution that was her own. Outside, Tyson walked through the streets of Manhattan, the cold wind blowing against his face as he stuffed his hands into his coat pockets. His mind was in a whirl, Ava's words echoing like a hammer. He didn't know why her rejection affected him so much, but he knew there was more at stake than just coffee, something that pulled him towards her in a way he couldn't explain or avoid. Ava was exhausted. The morning at the Bean and Hearth was busier than usual, with customers coming and going in a constant stream. But his mind seemed disconnected from it all. The sound of cups being placed on plates and lively conversations in the background were drowned out by the words from the confrontation with Tyson, which echoed repeatedly in his head. Every cup she placed on the counter brought with it a pang of guilt mixed with the stubbornness that kept her firm in her decision not to give in. The cafe's atmosphere, normally so comforting, felt oppressive that morning. The aroma of roasted coffee was intense, mixed with the sweet touch of vanilla from the freshly baked cookies. Molly's soft floral scent, which Ava used to like, seemed stronger than usual, invading the space between the familiar scents. Even so, none of this penetrated the barrier of tension that Ava carried in her increasingly hunched shoulders. As I looked at the clock on the wall, feeling the time passing in a distressing way, the doorbell rang. Ava looked up, her heart racing for a moment. Part of him expected to see Tyson entering again with his unmistakable presence. But it was a delivery man who entered, carrying a manila envelope. He barely glanced at Ava, placing the package on the counter with an automatic gesture. "For the cafe owner," he said, before hurriedly walking out the door. Ava frowned, wiped her hands on her apron, and picked up the envelope. When he opened it, he found a document with the real estate conglomerate's logo at the top. The formality of the letter contrasted brutally with the threat implicit in his cold words. They were intensifying the pressure, making it clear that they would take legal action if she continued to resist. Each line seemed more calculated than the last, with a tone that made Ava's stomach turn. As she read, feeling the frustration and fear rising within her, the doorbell rang again. This time, it was Tyson. He entered with purposeful steps, dressed very differently than Ava was used to. He wore a black leather jacket that looked as functional as it was elegant, over a dark shirt that highlighted the depth of his blue eyes. But what caught Ava's attention was his expression. Tense, almost troubled. He seemed to carry a nervous energy that contrasted with his usual controlled demeanor. "We need to talk," he said bluntly, approaching the counter. Ava felt her stomach tighten. He was still processing the contents of the document, and Tyson's presence seemed to intensify the chaos in his mind. "Tyson, now is not a good time," she began, trying to keep her voice steady, although she couldn't completely hide her tiredness. "I'm not leaving until you hear me." He placed a file on the counter and pushed it towards her. Ava hesitated, looking at him before taking the file and opening it. When he saw the contents, his heart stopped for a moment. Inside were photos and documents that spoke louder than any words could. Anonymous testimonies, emails, and financial records detailed illegal practices, bribes, threats, sabotage. The real estate conglomerate wasn't just aggressive in its approach. He was clearly willing to destroy anyone who stood in his way. "What is that?" Ava asked, looking up at Tyson, her eyebrows furrowed in confusion and fear. "Evidence," he replied, crossing his arms. "The real estate conglomerate is involved in illegal practices. This is much bigger than just buying the building. They are willing to use any means possible to get what they want." Ava felt a shiver run down her spine. The photos on the pages in front of him showed checks written to local politicians, manipulated contracts, and messages that left little room for doubt about the company's intentions. "Why do you have this?" she asked, her voice lower now. Tyson held her gaze, his expression as firm as his response. "I have contacts, people who work in corporate investigations. When I said I wanted to help you, Ava, I meant it." Ava's mind was a whirlwind. Part of her wanted to believe him, wanted to accept that help that seemed so essential. But another part, the stubborn part that had made her fight alone for so long, still hesitated. "That doesn't change anything," she said finally, pushing the file back toward him. "I still won't accept your help." Tyson clenched his jaw, his eyes shining with a mix of frustration and urgency. "Ava, this isn't about you or me. It's about Bean and Hearth. It's about what you've built here. They won't stop, and you need to understand that." Ava shook her head, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. "I don't need you to fight my battles, Tyson. I can take care of this alone." "No, you can't," he replied, his voice rising a little higher. "And that's not weakness, it's reality." The tension between them felt so thick that the air in the cafe felt heavier. But before Ava could respond, a loud noise from the kitchen interrupted them. "What was that?" Tyson asked, already heading towards the door that led to the back. Ava followed, feeling her heart race as she crossed the space. When they reached the kitchen, they found a torn bag of coffee beans on the floor, the beans scattered everywhere. The small window at the back was open, swaying slightly in the wind. "It wasn't like this when I closed last night," Ava said, her voice shaking. Tyson examined the window, his expression growing darker. It wasn't the wind. Someone came in here. Ava felt her blood run cold. Who would do something like that? And why? His mind raced with frightening possibilities as Tyson scanned the room with wide-eyed attention. Before she could formulate a response, Molly walked through the front door, looking alarmed. "Ava, is everything okay? One of the customers said he saw someone hanging around the cafe earlier. I thought I'd come and check it out." Ava felt her legs tremble. Tyson placed a firm hand on his shoulder, his solid presence a small comfort in the midst of the panic. "We can't ignore this," he said, looking directly at her, his voice deep but full of determination. Ava nodded, still trying to process everything. As Tyson closed the front door again and checked the windows, she sat on the counter, trying to catch her breath. "You don't have to go through this alone," he said, softer now, his eyes fixed on hers. "I am here." Ava looked at him, seeing something in his eyes that seemed different. It wasn't just determination. It was genuine concern, a need to protect her that she hadn't noticed before. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Although she was still confused and conflicted, Ava knew she couldn't ignore what was happening. And for the first time, she felt like maybe it wouldn't be so wrong to have Tyson by her side in this fight. The night was cold and silent, the kind of silence that seemed to amplify the sound of every footstep and whisper around it. Ava was in the passenger seat of Tyson's car, her hands folded in her lap, still shaking slightly despite the heater being on. The accident at the cafe had left a mark on his face, eyes slightly swollen with fatigue, lips pressed into a tense line. She didn't want to leave, but Tyson had insisted, saying it would be safer to spend the night outside while they assessed what had happened. "You didn't have to do that," Ava murmured, looking outside, watching the lights of Manhattan shine in sharp contrast to the emptiness she felt. "Yes, I needed to," Tyson replied, his voice firm but not harsh. He kept his eyes on the road, his fingers gripping the steering wheel with a force that revealed how tense he was. "You saw what happened. This was no accident." Ava wanted to argue, wanted to reassert her independence, but something about the way he spoke, the concern evident in his voice, kept her silent. She knew he was right, although she was still reluctant to admit it. The car finally stopped in front of an elegant glass and steel building. The well-lit entrance gave the impression that the place was immune to the chaos that seemed to dominate the world outside. Tyson got out first, quickly walking around the car to open Ava's door. She hesitated for a moment before accepting his help, feeling the cold night air wrap around her shoulders as she climbed out. The entrance to the building had a faint aroma of polished wood, mixed with the discreet scent of fresh flowers. Ava looked around as Tyson led her to the elevator. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it carried a weight that neither of them seemed to want to break. When they arrived at Tyson's apartment, she was surprised. The place was luxurious, but in an unexpected way. The glass walls offered a stunning view of the city, and the furniture was modern and minimalist, but each piece seemed carefully chosen. It wasn't what she expected from a man like him. "You can make yourself comfortable," said Tyson, taking off his coat and throwing it over the back of a chair. He gestured toward the couch. "I'll get you something warm." Ava nodded, sitting down on the soft leather couch. For a moment, he let himself be carried away by the feeling of security that the place offered. The warmth of the room contrasted with the cold, that seemed to have seeped into their bones since the moment they discovered the broken window in the cafe. Tyson returned with 2 cups of steaming tea, handing one to Ava before sitting in the armchair across from her. She held the cup between her hands, feeling the heat spread across her skin. "Thank you," she said finally. Tyson just nodded, his eyes fixed on her as if he was waiting for her to say more. When the silence persisted, he sighed and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You don't have to do this alone, Ava." She looked up, meeting his intense gaze. "Do what?" "Load everything. Fight everyone, pretending everything is fine when it clearly isn't." Ava looked away, feeling a mixture of frustration and vulnerability that bothered her deeply. "It's not that simple, Tyson. This coffee is all I have. I can't just let someone else fight for me." "And who said you're leaving?" he replied, his voice getting a little lower, almost a whisper. "I just want to be by your side." The sincerity in his words took her by surprise. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For a long moment, only the distant sound of the city below surrounded them. "Have you ever lost something that meant everything to you?" she asked, finally breaking the silence. Tyson leaned back in the chair, crossing his arms. Her expression changed, becoming darker, as if she had touched a memory he preferred to keep buried. "Yes," he said, after a pause. Ava leaned forward slightly, watching him carefully. She knew there was something more to Tyson than he let on, something that made him so controlled and yet so human. Was it boxing? She ventured, knowing that she might be crossing a line. Tyson took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. It was more than that. He got up, walking to the window. For a moment, he was silent, looking at the city lights as if searching for the right words. "When I started boxing, it was all I had. It was the only thing that made sense, the only place where I felt alive. Every fight, every victory, felt like I was proving to the world and to myself that I was more than they thought." Ava watched him silently, sensing he was about to reveal something he rarely shared. But the world of boxing is not just about talent and determination. There are people who want to control everything, who see you as a piece on their board. And when I refused to play their game, when I decided I wouldn't sell my fights, they found another way to take me down. He turned to face her, and Ava saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Pain. They spread rumors, manipulated the media, bought referees. In the end, I lost more than just the title. I lost my name, my career, my identity. Ava felt a lump in her throat. She knew what it was like to lose something so essential that it seemed impossible to recover. "Tyson, I didn't know." He gave a sad smile, returning to sit in the armchair. "It's not something I like to talk about. Not because I'm ashamed, but because reliving it is like opening a wound that never healed." Ava placed the cup on the table and reached out to touch his hand. He looked at her, surprised, but didn't back down. "You are more than that, Tyson. More than any title or scandal." Her words seemed to hang heavy in the air, and for a moment, Tyson didn't know how to respond. There was something about Ava, a disarming honesty, that made him want to believe her. "Thank you," he said finally, squeezing her hand lightly. The moment between them was silent, but full of meaning. They both knew there was much more to say, but that night, words were enough. Soft morning light filtered through the windows of Tyson's apartment, painting golden streaks on the white walls. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the light woodsy aroma of the room, coming from an unlit candle in a corner of the room. Ava was sitting on the couch, her bare feet against the soft upholstery as she held a mug in her hands. The warmth of the liquid was comforting, but her mind was far away, caught up in the whirlwind of events that had brought her to that moment. Tyson, in turn, was leaning against the kitchen counter, watching her in silence. He was holding his own mug, but he hadn't taken a single sip. His blue eyes were fixed on Ava, trying to decipher the thoughts she seemed to hide so well. She was dressed simply jeans and a thick sweater, but something about her posture made her look fragile, as if she were carrying an invisible weight. "Did you sleep?" he finally asked, breaking the silence that filled the room. Ava looked up, blinking as if she had been brought back to reality. "A little." Tyson frowned. He knew that a little meant that she probably spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, reliving the scare from the day before. He walked over, sitting in the armchair across from her. The movement made Ava adjust herself on the couch, straightening her posture as if she was preparing to hear something serious. "We need to talk about what's next," he said, placing the mug on the coffee table. "What's next?" Ava repeated, her voice low, but with a defensive tone. "The coffee, the conglomerate, the threat you are facing." Tyson leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You can't do this alone, Ava." She opened her mouth to respond, but he raised his hand, cutting her off. "I'm not saying you're not capable. I'm saying you shouldn't have to do this alone." Ava looked at him, and for the first time since they arrived at the apartment, she saw something different in his gaze. It wasn't just determination. It was something deeper, more personal, like he was fighting something inside himself as he tried to help her. "I don't know what to do, Tyson," she finally admitted. His words were a whisper, barely audible, but they carried the full weight of his frustration. "Every time I try to find a solution, it seems like there is a new barrier." Tyson reached his hand across the table, covering hers. The touch was firm but gentle, as if he wanted to convey something he couldn't put into words. "So we found a solution together." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was charged with a mutual understanding, a recognition that they were both immersed in something far greater than either of them could face alone. Ava didn't remove her hand, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow down. Their eyes met, and Ava realized there was something about Tyson that she hadn't noticed before. He wasn't just the confident, controlling CEO she'd first imagined. He was a marked man, someone who had lost so much, and yet he was there, offering his strength to her. Tyson stood up, pulling a sheet of paper from a nearby drawer and placing it on the desk. "We need a plan," he said, picking up a pen. "The conglomerate may have power, but that doesn't mean they are untouchable." Ava watched as he began to draw schematics and jot down ideas. Her mind was still caught up in the tension from the previous touch, but she forced herself to focus. He walked over and sat down next to him, leaning over to get a better look at the notes. "What if we use the community?" she suggested, pointing to one of the points he had written. "Bean and Hearth is not just a cafe. It's a place where people meet, share stories. Maybe we can get customers involved." Tyson nodded, getting the idea immediately. A community movement. Mobilize people to show that this cafe is more than a business. They spent hours creating the plan, discussing strategies and anticipating potential obstacles. The sunlight changed from golden to a cooler tone, indicating that the afternoon was already advancing, but neither of them seemed to notice. Finally, when everything seemed clear, Ava leaned back on the couch, exhaling a long sigh. Tyson did the same, but not before placing his pen on the table and turning to her. "You're going to make it, Ava. We're going to make it." Ava smiled, a small but genuine smile. For a moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Tyson continued to look at her, and something in his expression changed. He leaned in slightly, as if he was going to say something, but hesitated. Ava, feeling the change in the air, sat up straighter on the couch, and their eyes met again. There was a tension in the space between them, something that seemed to pulse like an electric current. Tyson reached out, touching her face lightly, his fingers brushing her skin with a delicacy that made her breath catch. "Ava," his voice was a whisper, and she knew what was about to happen. There were no barriers between them anymore, no excuses they could use to avoid the inevitable. She leaned in slightly, and their lips met in a kiss that started tentatively but quickly intensified. The world around them disappeared. The smell of coffee, the distant sound of traffic, everything seemed insignificant compared to the intensity of that moment. Tyson lightly pulled her closer, as if to make sure she didn't leave. When they separated, they were both out of breath. Ava looked at him, her face flushed but unrepentant. Tyson also looked different, as if something about him had changed forever. She began, but couldn't finish the sentence. "Inevitable," he added, with a small smile. They laughed softly, and for a moment, the weight of everything they were facing seemed lighter. But the moment was interrupted by the sound of Tyson's cell phone vibrating on the table. He picked up the device, and the expression on his face immediately changed. "What it was?" Ava asked, noticing the change. "It's about the conglomerate. But also, it feels like someone from my past is getting involved in this." Ava frowned, feeling the warmth of the previous moment being replaced by a wave of worry. "What do you mean?" Tyson sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It means things are about to get even more complicated." The morning dawned gray, with dense clouds covering the sky, as if the weather reflected Tyson's state of mind. The normally vibrant streets of Manhattan seemed duller in the dull light of day. The cold wind blew across the sidewalks, scattering damp leaves and carrying the metallic smell of approaching rain. Inside the bean and hearth, however, the warmth of the amber light bulbs and the comforting aroma of fresh coffee created a welcoming bubble that Tyson barely noticed. Sitting at his usual table near the window, Tyson had his fingers intertwined on the wooden table and his shoulders tense, as if supporting an invisible weight. He stared into the void beyond the glass, where hurried pedestrians passed by wrapped in thick coats. The constant vibrancy of the city contrasted with the restlessness that consumed him. His mind was stuck on the message he had received the night before, a dark reminder of a past he would rather leave buried. At the counter, Ava was preparing a latte with precise but mechanical movements. Since the kiss they had shared, something had changed between them. It was a palpable tension, but also an energy that made her feel alive in a new way. Despite that, she couldn't ignore Tyson's grim expression. He seemed more closed off, as if something was eating him up inside. She gave him a worried look, but before she could ask anything, the doorbell rang. Ava looked up, expecting another regular customer, but the figure that entered made the entire cafe seem colder. A tall man with slightly disheveled dark hair, wearing a navy blue suit that looked like it cost a fortune, walked into Bean and Hearth with firm, confident steps. His smile was wide, but there was something predatory about it, something that made Ava shiver. "Tyson Cooper," called the man, his voice echoing through the cafe with exaggerated theatricality. Tyson froze. His body, once tense, seemed to have become even more rigid. He turned slowly, as if preparing for a blow. When his eyes met the man, his expression hardened, his features becoming sharper, and a thread of anger flashed in his gaze. "Luke," Tyson replied, his voice low and controlled, but filled with a hostility that Ava had never heard before. Luke walked over to Tyson's table as if he owned the place, pulling out a chair and sitting down uninvited. His smile remained, but it was devoid of warmth, a gesture more calculated than genuine. "Long time ago, friend," Luke said, crossing his legs and leaning back in his chair. "We're not friends," Tyson replied, short and direct, his words like cutting steel. The cafe, which had once seemed full of comfortable murmurs, became quieter. Nearby customers slowed their conversations, sensing the tension in the air. Ava, standing behind the counter, couldn't take her eyes off the scene. Tyson's intense gaze and Luke's dismissive arrogance made the room vibrate with something she couldn't define. "Oh, don't be like that, Tyson. We share a story, don't we?" Luke continued, his voice permeated with irony. "Difficult times, of course, but also glorious. What do you want?" Tyson leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Luke as if he wanted to pierce him. Luke paused deliberately, as if savoring the tension before responding. "I want to remind you that secrets have a funny way of appearing when we least expect them." The words were spoken lightly, but the threat behind them was clear. Ava felt a shiver run down her spine as she tried to understand what was happening. Tyson, on the other hand, remained motionless, but the clenching of his hands on the table revealed his anger. "Don't test me, Luke," Tyson said, his voice low and full of warning. Luke raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender, but his smile remained intact. "Relax, Cooper. I'm just here to talk. But maybe we can continue this conversation somewhere else? I have nothing to discuss with you. In that case, maybe I need to talk to other people." Luke stood up, adjusting his suit with slow, calculated movements. He glanced around the cafe, his eyes briefly landing on Ava before returning to Tyson. "It was good to see you, friend. I'm sure we'll see you soon." With that, he left, leaving a heavy silence in the air. Tyson remained motionless, his fists clenched as his breathing seemed heavier than normal. Ava, unable to contain her curiosity and concern, slowly approached. "Who was he?" she asked, sitting in the chair opposite him. Tyson let out a long sigh, running his hands over his face before responding. Luke was my friend, or at least I thought it was. We fought together at the beginning of our careers, but he chose a different path. Ava frowned, waiting for him to continue. He was involved in illegal betting, organized fights, dirty things. When I refused to participate, he saw me as an obstacle. He was the one who started the rumors that destroyed my reputation. There was a heavy silence as Ava processed what she had heard. The pieces began to fall into place, but she knew there was more. Tyson was leaving something out, and she could see it in his expression. He's threatening you, isn't he? Tyson hesitated before slowly nodding. He wants money. You think you can blackmail me with distorted stories? He knows how to make lies seem like truths. Ava felt a wave of indignation rise within her. That's ridiculous, Tyson. You can't let him do this to you. Tyson stood up abruptly, starting to pace back and forth. You think I don't know that? He stopped, taking a deep breath before continuing. But it's not that simple. Luke is a master at manipulating people. He knows how to turn the narrative in his favor. Ava stood up too, determined. Then let's expose the truth before he has a chance to do anything. Tyson looked at her, surprised by the firmness in her voice. For a moment, he saw something in Ava's eyes, a mix of determination and support that almost disarmed him. Ava, I can't risk involving you in this. I'm already involved, Tyson. There was a moment of silence between them, filled with tension and something deeper that they both felt, but didn't verbalize. Tyson knew he wanted to protect her, but he also knew that Ava wasn't someone who would simply back down from a threat. Okay, he said finally, but I need you to trust me. Ava hesitated for a moment, but nodded. Confidence is a good start, but we need proof. Tyson nodded too, knowing she was right. As Ava returned to the counter, he watched her with a mix of gratitude and concern. He knew this battle would be one of the hardest of his life, but Ava's strength gave him something he didn't know he needed. Hope that this time, he wouldn't be alone. The cool light of dawn filtered through the bean and hearth's windows, casting long shadows on the polished wooden floor. The cafe was still closed, but Ava was already there, moving through the space with automatic movements. His hands seemed to act on their own, lining up cups on the counter and checking inventory while his mind was miles away. There was a tension in the air that she couldn't shake, an almost physical weight that pressed against her chest. The argument with Tyson the night before was burned into her memory like a movie she couldn't stop watching. The words spoken, the emotions that got out of control, everything seemed to be echoing in the silence of the empty cafe. Tyson hadn't appeared since. She knew he was dealing with Luke and the threats that came with his former friend's return. But something else had happened. Something Ava couldn't name. The doorbell rang, breaking his thoughts. She turned quickly, expecting to find Tyson, but it was Molly who entered, bringing with her the fresh smell of morning air, mixed with the floral perfume she always wore. You're here early, Molly commented, placing her bag behind the counter. Ava forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I had trouble sleeping. I thought it would be better to do something useful. Molly nodded, but didn't look convinced. She knew Ava well enough to realize when something was wrong, but chose not to pressure her. The morning business started slowly, with regulars coming and going, exchanging quick greetings with Ava as they picked up their orders. But even with the constant flow, the cafe felt empty. Tyson's absence was palpable, and Ava couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Around noon, as Ava was cleaning the counter, Molly hesitantly approached. Ava, are you okay? The simple question almost dismantled her. Ava stopped what she was doing, holding the cloth between her hands as she tried to organize her thoughts. I don't know, she finally replied. Molly frowned, leaning in slightly as if to understand better. Does this have to do with Tyson? Ava looked up at her in surprise, but soon realized there was no reason to hide it. Molly was observant, and anyone with eyes could see that something had changed between her and Tyson in the last few weeks. He's dealing with a lot, Ava said, her voice low, and I think I wasn't fair to him. Do you want to talk about this? Ava hesitated, but ended up shaking her head. I don't know if that would help. The afternoon passed slowly, and Ava felt every minute as if it were hours. When the movement finally subsided, she was left alone in the cafe, arranging the tables in a silence that seemed to amplify her uneasiness. She picked up the phone several times, thinking about calling Tyson, but always gave up before completing the call. Meanwhile, Tyson was in his apartment, looking at the city view without actually seeing it. His mind was caught in a whirlwind of thoughts, each one heavier than the last. He had spent the night awake, trying to find a solution to the problem with Luke, but instead he ended up churning through memories and regrets. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was complicating Ava's life. Ever since he got closer to her, it seemed like the problems had multiplied. The real estate conglomerate, Luke's return, the threats, and now the risk of his own secrets being used against him. Tyson felt like he was dragging Ava into a world she shouldn't know. The phone in his hand vibrated from time to time, but he didn't answer it. Several calls from Ava appeared on the screen, but he simply looked at her name without the courage to respond. He knew he needed to get away. It was the only way to protect her. The next day, Ava woke up feeling empty. She tried to distract herself with work at the cafe, but Tyson's absence was like a hole that nothing could fill. She checked her phone several times, but there were no missed messages or calls. Finally, late in the afternoon, she decided to go to his apartment. The building was imposing, with its glass facade reflecting the glow of the setting sun. Ava walked into the lobby, feeling her heart beat faster with each step. When she reached Tyson's apartment door, she hesitated for a moment before knocking. The wait seemed endless, but when the door finally opened, it wasn't Tyson who appeared. "Can I help you?" asked a tall man with a neutral expression. "I'm looking for Tyson." "Is he?" Ava asked, trying not to sound as anxious as she felt. The man shook his head. "He asked me to take care of some things while he was gone. He didn't mention when he would return." Ava felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. "Did he leave? Where to?" "I don't know, miss. He left no details." Ava quickly thanked her and left the building, feeling the weight of the situation finally crashing down on her. Tyson had left without saying anything, without even an explanation. The next few days were a blur. Ava tried to focus on her coffee, but Tyson's absence was always on her mind. She wondered if she had done something wrong, if she had said something that had pushed him away. Doubt gnawed at her, but more than that, she missed him. Not just the help or the protective presence, but the man he was, with all his imperfections and secrets. She realized that Tyson had become an important part of her life, even if she didn't want to admit it before. Now that he was gone, Ava felt like something essential was missing. In his apartment, Tyson felt the same way. He was staying in a temporary place, trying to avoid being found, while he searched for a way to solve the problems that Luke had brought into his life. But through it all, his thoughts kept returning to Ava. He knew she was hurt, but he believed he was doing the right thing by walking away. However, as the days went by, Tyson began to realize that perhaps he was wrong. He didn't want to put Ava in danger, but he also didn't want to lose the connection they had built. The two were worlds apart, but they both felt the same longing that seemed to fill every silent moment. The bean and hearth was immersed in an unusual silence. The soft sound of the clock hanging on the wall filled the empty space, echoing like a steady beat that reminded Ava of the time she felt was slipping through her fingers. Autumn sunlight streamed through the windows, painting streaks of gold across the polished wood floor, but Ava was unmoved by its beauty. She was sitting at one of the back tables, surrounded by scattered papers and the cold glow of her laptop screen. Every document, every email opened in front of her was a piece of a cruel puzzle that mixed anger and despair in equal measures. The familiar scent of fresh coffee filled the air, mixed with the warm cinnamon scent of the donuts Molly had baked earlier. But Ava barely noticed the smells that were normally so comforting to her. His mind was immersed in the details of the evidence. With each line read, with each invoice I analyzed, the pieces fell into place in a disturbing way. The real estate conglomerate didn't just want to buy the building, it wanted to crush it. The evidence was clear. Bribes to government officials, falsified documents, veiled pressure on other merchants in the region. It was a cold and calculated strategy, but now she had the evidence to expose everything. When she closed the laptop, the crack of sound broke the silence, and Ava let out a deep sigh, pressing her fingers against her temples. Despite the victory that those tests represented, the weight of knowing what came next crushed her. She knew that facing them alone was impossible. The gears in this system were too big, too sharp. She needed help, and only one name came to mind: Tyson. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to remove the mix of emotions that his thought brought. The recent separation still hurt. He had disappeared without explanation, leaving behind a gap that was difficult to fill. Ava knew it wouldn't be easy to go after him, but she also knew he was the only person who could help her. He understood this world. He knew how these people thought. More than that, despite everything, Ava trusted him. She began to collect the papers spread across the table with quick and sudden movements, the sound of the paper clashing echoing through the space. Molly, who was taking a break upstairs, was nowhere to be seen, leaving the cafe in an even heavier silence. Ava organized the documents and put everything in a folder, feeling her determination grow amidst the uncertainty. Less than an hour later, Ava was in front of the building where Tyson lived. The cold wind cut into her skin, making her pull her coat tighter against her body. The streets were full of people rushing about, but Ava felt alone in the sea of movement. She took a deep breath, observing the building's facade, as if that would give her the courage she needed. The doorman recognized her immediately this time, and without questions, allowed her entry. As the elevator rose, Ava felt her heart beat faster, each floor bringing her closer to Tyson. When she arrived, she stopped in front of his door and hesitated for a moment. The dark wood seemed intimidating somehow, but she took a deep breath and knocked. The seconds that followed seemed like an eternity. When he heard footsteps on the other side, his body tensed. The door partially opened, revealing Tyson. He looked different. The confident man Ava knew looked worn out. His hair was slightly disheveled. A shadow of beard covered his face, and his blue eyes, normally so bright, were cloudy. "Ava," he said, his voice hoarse, almost hesitant. She stared at him for a moment, holding the folder to her chest as if it were a shield. "We can talk?" Tyson opened the door completely and gestured for her to enter. Ava took a tentative step inside and was immediately struck by the contrast between what she remembered and what she saw. The apartment was dark, the curtains drawn allowing only a trickle of natural light to enter. The air was heavy, with a faint smell of old coffee mixed with something bitter, as if the energy of the place reflected Tyson's condition. The disorder around her was something she would never associate with him. There were papers scattered on the table, an empty whiskey glass on the kitchen counter, a jacket thrown on the couch. "It sounds like you're not taking care of yourself," Ava commented, concern evident in her voice. Tyson leaned against the wall, crossing his arms as he watched her. "What do you want, Ava?" His words were harsher than she expected, but Ava stood her ground. "I found evidence that the conglomerate is acting illegally," she said, placing the folder on the table and opening it. She began to spread out the documents in front of him. "Bribes, forgeries, manipulations. It's all illegal, Tyson. They're not just trying to buy the building. They're trying to destroy anyone who gets in their way." Tyson approached, looking at the papers with an expression that alternated between skepticism and curiosity. "And what do you expect me to do?" "I hope you will help me. You know this world. You know how these people think. I need someone who is willing to fight with me." Tyson took a step back, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "Ava, do you have any idea what you're asking for? These people don't play. They play dirty. And you think I don't know that?" She replied, her voice rising. "I'm not giving up coffee, Tyson. It's the only thing that still connects me to my mother." Ava's words hung in the air, charged with emotion. Tyson looked away, pressing his lips together as he struggled with his own thoughts. "I know you're dealing with your own issues," Ava continued, her voice softer. "But this isn't just about me. It's about fighting something bigger, something that destroys people like me every day." There was a long silence between them. Tyson finally looked at her, and Ava saw the internal battle he was fighting. He wanted to help, but he was trapped in his own fears and insecurities. "Ava, I don't know if I'm the right person for this." "You are," she said firmly. "Not because he's perfect, but because he understands what it means to lose everything and have to start over." Tyson looked away again, but this time it wasn't out of fear. He was processing her words, letting them sink into his heart. After a moment that seemed to last an eternity, he sighed and nodded. "All good. I will help." The relief Ava felt was almost overwhelming. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked but full of gratitude. "Don't thank me yet," Tyson replied, organizing the papers on the table. This is going to be complicated. Although they both knew the battle was just beginning, in that moment, Ava felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Ava stood in the center of bean and hearth, her arms crossed and her gaze fixed on the door, as if she could summon Tyson by the power of her will. The dim light of the cloudy morning reflected off the puddles outside as the rain fell in irregular rhythms, creating small rivers that flowed past the cafe's windows. The room was filled with the warm, comforting smell of fresh coffee and freshly baked bread. But Ava barely registered the familiar sense that used to soothe her. There was a storm inside her that mirrored the weather outside, and the silence of the cafe only seemed to amplify her tension. Since Tyson agreed to help her, things had moved forward on paper, but emotionally they were stagnant. He was there, but at the same time he wasn't. There was an invisible distance, a barrier that he maintained even when they worked side by side. Ava knew this went beyond Luke's threats or the fight against the conglomerate. Tyson was struggling with something inside, something he wasn't ready to share yet. The doorbell finally rang, breaking Ava out of her thoughts. She turned quickly and saw Tyson enter, bringing with him cold, damp air. He was wearing a dark coat, heavy from the rain that had left him drenched. Small droplets glistened in the warm coffee light, slowly running down the fabric. Her hair was wet, some strands stuck to her forehead, and her face carried a tired, almost exhausted expression that made Ava's heart squeeze involuntarily. "You're late," she said, her voice firm but betrayed by a slight tremor that reflected the mixture of irritation and concern she felt. Tyson took off his coat with a sudden movement, hanging it on the nearest chair. He didn't respond immediately, just ran his hand through his wet hair, brushing the strands away from his face. "You know, Tyson, it can't go on like this," began Ava, crossing her arms more tightly, trying to control the emotions that threatened to overflow. He finally looked at her, frowning as if trying to understand what she meant. "Like this? So you hear, but not really hear." Ava took a step forward, her voice firmer now. "You agreed to help me, but it's clear you're still running from something." Tyson sighed, squinting his eyes for a moment before responding. "I'm here, Ava. I'm doing what you asked." "It's not enough." Her response was quick, almost cutting. "You're just fulfilling an obligation. But what I need is someone who really fights. Not just for me, but for yourself." The cafe became even quieter. The soft sound of rain tapping against the windows seemed muffled by the tension that now filled the space. Tyson stood still, his eyes fixed on Ava's, as if her words had hit him harder than he wanted to admit. "Do you think it's that simple?" he asked finally, his voice low but full of repressed emotion. Ava felt a lump in her throat, but she refused to back down. "No, I don't think it's simple." She took another step towards him, emotions overflowing in her voice. "I think it's difficult, painful, and scary. But that's what it means to fight, Tyson. You can't keep carrying everything alone, and at the same time, distancing yourself from everyone." Tyson took a step back, as if trying to create space between them. But Ava didn't stop. She could see the internal battle in his eyes, the conflict between wanting to open up and the fear of being hurt again. "I already lost everything once," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "You don't understand what this is, Ava." "No, I understand." Her response came quickly, full of emotion. "I know what it's like to lose everything. I know what it's like to feel like the whole world is against you. But I also know that running away doesn't solve anything." Tyson lowered his head, shoulders slumping slightly, as if the weight of her words had finally caught up with him. Ava took a final step, closing the distance between them even further. "You are strong, Tyson, not because of what he achieved, but because he is still here. You're still fighting, even if you don't realize it. But if you keep sabotaging yourself, if you keep running away, you'll end up losing more than you've already lost." The silence that followed was so thick that Ava could hear the ragged sound of her own breathing. Tyson finally lifted his head, and there was something different in his eyes now. It wasn't just pain, it was determination, a spark she hadn't seen in a long time. "You're right," he said, his voice firmer now, but still charged with emotion. "I've been running away, and it needs to stop." Ava felt a wave of relief so intense she almost took her breath away. "So what are you going to do?" Tyson took a step forward, closing the distance between them until there was barely any space. His expression was resolute, but his eyes maintained a softness that caught her by surprise. "I'll face it, Luke, the conglomerate, everything. I can't keep letting the past control me." Before Ava could respond, Tyson took another step. His eyes never left hers, and she felt the air shift between them. In a slow, purposeful movement, he pulled her gently but firmly, holding her shoulders as his eyes searched hers, as if searching for something deeper. "I can't promise I'll get it right every time," he said, his voice low and sincere, "but I can promise I won't run away again." Without waiting for a response, he kissed her. It wasn't hesitant or cautious like the first kiss they shared. It was intense, full of emotion. Tyson seemed to put everything into that moment, all the words he couldn't say, all the feelings he didn't know how to express. Ava felt the world disappear around her. The sound of rain, the smell of coffee, everything seemed distant as she gave in to the kiss. Your hands came up to cup his face, feeling the texture of his stubble and the strength contained in his touch. When they finally broke apart, they were both panting, but something had changed between them, something deep and unbreakable. Tyson smiled slightly, touching Ava's face with his fingertips, as if he wanted to engrave that moment in her memory. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Ava felt tears fill her eyes, but they were of relief and not sadness. It was never an option. They were silent for a few seconds, just looking at each other, until Tyson pulled away slightly, his expression changing to something more focused. "Let's start with Luke. It's time to put an end to this once and for all." Ava nodded, feeling that, for the first time, they were truly aligned. Whatever came, they would face it together. The day of confrontation had finally arrived, bringing with it a dense energy that seemed to permeate the air, like a storm ready to explode. Ava woke up early, her eyes still heavy with fatigue, but her mind already on full alert. The light rain pattered gently against the window of your small apartment, creating random patterns that ran down the glass. She sat at the kitchen table, looking at the pamphlets and notes she had spread out the night before. The strong aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the room, but today it didn't bring the usual comfort. The weight of responsibility seemed overwhelming. Every word on the poster she had organized was a reminder of what was at stake: the coffee, the community, her mother's legacy. There was an invisible pressure that seemed to envelop his shoulders, making even the simplest task, like sipping coffee, monumental. She took a deep breath, running her fingers through her hair tied into a hasty bun as she looked at her to-do list. Failing was not an option. At the same moment, Tyson was in his own silent battle. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting the cuffs of his white shirt with calculated movements. The reflection in the mirror was of a man who had changed, and not just physically. There was something more resolute in her eyes, something he had missed for years. The faint scent of his woodsy cologne mingled with the scent of fresh soap in the air. But his focus was on the serious expression on his face. As he put on his tie, his hands shook slightly, betraying the nervousness he was trying to hide. The idea of facing Luke in the public, of exposing herself and revisiting such a painful past, was suffocating. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment. Ava's words echoed in her mind. "You are strong not because of what you have achieved, but because you are still here." And that was what kept him going. Back at Bean and Hearth, Ava was in the middle of a community campaign that had turned into something much bigger than she expected. The cafe was packed with volunteers, loyal customers, neighboring merchants, students from the nearby college, and even people who had heard her story online and decided to help. The energy in the room was electric, a combination of outrage and hope. The sweet aroma of freshly baked bread filled the air, cutting through the chemical smell of the fresh paint used for the posters and banners. Molly, her cheeks flushed from the heat of the kitchen, served trays of cookies to the volunteers while Ava organized the final instructions. "Okay guys," Ava said, raising her voice to be heard over the hubbub. "This cafe is not just a business. It is a space of unity, stories, and community. We need to show the conglomerate that we will not give in." The response was immediate. Applause and shouts of encouragement echoed through the cafe, making Ava's heart beat faster. She smiled, but the nervousness remained like a knot in her stomach. "I knew I was doing what was necessary. But Tyson's battle was a constant reminder that this fight was bigger than just saving a coffee. Hours later, in a crowded sports center, Tyson was in the center of a makeshift ring. The room felt suffocating, lit by spotlights that cast dramatic shadows on the attentive faces of the audience. The smell of sweat and tension filled the room, while the sound of clicking cameras echoed through the space. On the other side of the ring stood Luke, a cynical smile plastered on his face. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, but his posture exuded arrogance and provocation. He seemed to savor every moment, as if he had already won the battle. "You finally have the courage to show up, Tyson," Luke said, his voice loud and full of sarcasm. "But I wonder if you have the courage to face the truth." Tyson didn't react immediately. He took a deep breath, allowing the weight of Ava's words to strengthen him. It wasn't just about clearing his name or defeating Luke. It was about taking back control of your narrative, about breaking free from the chains of the past. "The truth is something you've never known, Luke," Tyson said, his voice firm, resonating clearly throughout the room. "You manipulated, destroyed careers, and tried to reduce me to nothing. But today, that ends." The audience murmured, and reporters frantically took down the words, while Luke let out a forced laugh. "Do you really think you have something to prove here? Everyone already knows who you are, Tyson. And that's exactly why I'm here," Tyson replied, interrupting him. His eyes were fixed on Luke, full of determination. "Because it's time for people to know what really happened." He gestured to the assistant at ringside, and a large screen turned on. The video that began to be shown showed compromising recordings of Luke, conversations with accomplices about illegal bets, fight manipulation, and schemes to destroy Tyson's reputation. The sound echoed through the room, each word landing like a blow in the silent environment. When the video ended, Tyson stepped forward. "I spent years carrying the guilt for something I didn't do, while you continued to manipulate and destroy lives. Today, that ends." The audience erupted in murmurs, many turning to look at Luke, who now looked uncomfortable. He tried to laugh again, but it was clear that the mask of confidence was falling apart. Some audience members began to applaud, while others shouted support for Tyson. Meanwhile, at Bean and Hearth, Ava was on the makeshift stage set up in front of the cafe. The smell of rain mixed with the aroma of fresh coffee, as the community gathered with signs in hand and voices full of determination. "This cafe is more than just a place to drink coffee," Ava said, her voice firm but full of emotion. "It's a symbol of resistance, a place where we build memories and bonds. Let's not let a conglomerate destroy this." The applause that followed was so loud that Ava felt a lump in her throat. Hot tears formed in her eyes, but they were of gratitude. The energy of the crowd was living proof of everything she and her mother had built. When night finally fell, Tyson arrived at the cafe, with adrenaline still pumping through his veins. Ava was behind the counter, surrounded by customers celebrating, laughing and sharing stories of victory. When she saw him, her smile lit up the room. "You did it," she said, approaching. "We did it," Tyson corrected, holding his hand firmly. They stayed there, in silence for a few moments, just looking at each other, as if they were finally at peace. In the midst of the struggles they had faced and those yet to come, they found something invaluable: strength in each other. The rhythmic sound of rain against the windows of Bean and Hearth was almost mesmerizing that morning. Ava was sitting at one of the corner tables, a stack of papers spread out in front of her and a mug of coffee in her hands. The familiar aroma of roasted grains mingled with the faint smell of freshly baked bread, creating an atmosphere that normally comforted her, but today only seemed to accentuate the uneasiness she felt. The community campaign had been a success, but the cafe still faced debts that seemed insurmountable. Despite local support, the conglomerate's threats, and the accumulated costs of recent months continued to hang like a shadow over it. Ava tried to focus on her notes, but her mind kept going back to Tyson. Since the confrontation with Luke, he seemed more determined, more present, but she knew something was worrying him. That afternoon, while setting up the counter, Ava saw Tyson walk through the door. He seemed calm, but there was something in his expression that she couldn't decipher. He wore a gray jacket that highlighted his broad shoulders, but his eyes had a dark intensity, as if he were carrying an invisible weight. He walked up to the counter and placed his hands on the polished wood, looking at her with a mix of determination and vulnerability. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm. Ava felt a knot form in her stomach. Something about his tone made her uneasy, but she nodded and gestured to a table in the corner where they could talk more privately. They sat down, and for a moment, the silence between them felt heavier than any words they could exchange. Ava was about to ask what was going on when Tyson broke the silence. "I sold part of my company." The words came out simple, but their impact was like a punch to Ava's stomach. She blinked, confused, trying to understand what he had just said. "What?" he asked, his voice wavering. "I sold part of my shares in the company," he repeated, his eyes fixed on hers. "I used the money to pay off your debts and make sure the cafe is protected." Ava felt the world around her spin. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. "Tyson, why?" He took a deep breath, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because you deserve it, Ava. Because this coffee means everything to you, and because I couldn't bear to see him disappear." She felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "You couldn't do that, Tyson. It's your company, your career. And what is a career without purpose?" He interrupted, his voice firm but not harsh. "I built my company to prove something to the world, but lately, I've realized that what really matters is helping the people I love." Ava shook her head, trying to absorb what he was saying. "You risked everything for me?" "It wasn't a risk, Ava. It was a choice." She was silent, looking at him as she tried to process the weight of the sacrifice he had made. Coffee was everything to her, but she never expected someone to go so far to protect it. "I don't know what to say," she murmured finally. "You don't need to say anything," Tyson replied, a small smile appearing on his lips. "Just don't give up on what you've built here." Ava felt the first tear run down her cheek and quickly wiped it away. "I will not give up. I will not let your sacrifice be in vain." Tyson nodded, and for the first time in a long time, Ava saw something in his eyes that seemed like relief. Over the next few days, Ava dove into her work at the cafe with renewed determination. She began to implement changes, modernizing some processes, and strengthening her connection with the community. Customers noticed the difference, and many began asking what had happened to make her seem so energized. However, Ava couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. As grateful as she was for Tyson's sacrifice, she knew he had risked a lot for her. She needed to find a way to reciprocate, to show that his gesture was not just appreciated, but that it had transformed something within her. One night, while reviewing the cafe's finances, Ava had an idea. She closed her laptop with a snap and picked up her phone. "Molly, can you take over the cafe tomorrow? I need to resolve something important." Molly agreed without hesitation, and Ava spent the night coming up with a plan. She knew she couldn't simply make up for Tyson's sacrifice with money or words. It needed to be something meaningful, something that showed him how much he had changed his life. The next day, Ava arrived early at Tyson's company headquarters. The building was imposing, with its glass facade reflecting the cloudy sky. She entered with firm steps, ignoring the nervousness that was in her chest. After passing through reception and being ushered into Tyson's office, she stood in front of the door for a moment before knocking. "Come in," said the familiar voice on the other side. Ava opened the door and found Tyson sitting behind an elegant desk with papers spread out in front of him. He seemed surprised to see her, but he stood up immediately, walking towards her. "Ava, what are you doing here?" She took a deep breath, holding a folder to her chest. "You did something incredible for me, Tyson. And I can't let this go without doing something for you too." He frowned, confused, as she handed him the folder. Tyson opened it, his eyes scanning the documents quickly. "What is that?" he asked, looking at her. "It's a plan to expand Bean and Hearth. I want to open a second unit, and I want it to be a partnership with your company." Tyson looked at her, surprised. "Ava, you believed in me when no one else did, Tyson. Now it's my turn to believe in both of us." The silence that followed was charged with emotion, but the expression on Tyson's face finally softened. He closed the folder and looked at her with a small smile. "Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure of you, Tyson." His smile widened, and for the first time, Ava felt like they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Ava was at Bean and Hearth, the table in the back cluttered with a collection of papers, folders, and a laptop with its screen flashing with charts and open emails. The strong smell of fresh coffee mixed with the light scent of cinnamon coming from the bread Molly had just baked. The rainy afternoon darkened the room, but the cafe's pendant lights created a warm glow that Ava normally found comforting. Today, however, the weight of the latest discoveries made it difficult to relax. Tyson was sitting in front of her, his posture leaning forward, his elbows resting on the table and his hands clasped together as if he was trying to contain something. He still wore the meeting jacket he had left minutes before, but the loose tie and the somber expression on his face showed that his mind was far from anything formal. "So that's it," Ava said, pushing a sheet of paper toward him. The firmness in his voice didn't hide his exhaustion. "These documents prove that the conglomerate is not only bribing local authorities but also manipulating contracts to expel small landowners." Tyson took the sheet and studied it silently, his eyes scanning each line carefully. She watched his face as he read, noticing the way his eyebrows furrowed and the tension in his jaw tightened. "Is that enough to take them down?" he asked, finally, placing the paper on the table. "It's a start, but we're going to need something more concrete for this to hold up in court." Tyson nodded slowly, his gaze falling away for a moment. He knew that fighting such a powerful conglomerate would require more than proof. It required strategy, patience, and reliable allies. But it was the next thought that worried him. He knew there was something more at play, something Ava didn't yet realize. "Ava, I need to tell you something," he said, his voice deep. She looked at him, confused but attentive. "Since I started investigating the conglomerate, something didn't make sense. The information Luke had about me, their movements, it was as if someone from the inside was passing information about me." Ava's eyes widened, processing what he was saying. "Anyone on your team?" Tyson nodded, his expression heavy. "Someone I trusted." The silence that followed was dense, broken only by the sound of coffee being brewed in the machine behind the counter. Ava felt a pang of worry mixed with indignation. She knew how much Tyson valued loyalty, and the idea that someone close to him was sabotaging him was a deep blow. "Do you have any idea who it could be?" "Not until this morning," he replied, leaning forward, his voice lower now, as if he didn't want anyone else to hear. "During a meeting, I received a notification of a suspicious funds transfer. I followed the trail, and everything points to my CFO, Alan." Ava blinked, trying to remember if she'd ever heard Tyson mention Alan before. "How long has he been working with you?" "Almost from the beginning," Tyson said, his voice thick with disappointment. "He was someone I trusted, but now it makes sense. He had access to everything. Contracts, financial information, even the contacts Luke used to target me." Ava took a deep breath, trying to absorb the weight of the situation. "So we need to prove that too." Tyson looked at her, admiring the way she seemed to accept the challenge with such determination. He knew she was also carrying a lot, but still, she was there beside him, ready to fight. "It won't be easy," he said finally. "It never is," Ava replied, a small smile appearing on her lips. "But we're in this together." The following hours were dedicated to devising the plan. Ava and Tyson shared the tasks, examining documents and discussing strategies. The cafe was practically empty now, except for Molly, who was silently cleaning the counter, casting curious glances in their direction every now and then. As they worked, Ava noticed something different about Tyson. He seemed lighter, as if he was finally allowing himself to believe that this battle could be won. She saw the gleam of determination in his eyes, something that had been dull for so long. What it was, Tyson asked, looking up when he noticed her look. Ava shook her head, a soft smile on her lips. "Nothing. I'm just glad you're here." Tyson held her gaze for a moment before smiling back. "Me too." The next morning, Tyson found Alan in his office. The man, middle-aged, with carefully combed gray hair and an impeccable suit, looked so sure of himself that Tyson felt his stomach tighten. He didn't want to believe that someone he trusted had done this, but the evidence was too clear to ignore. "Alan, I need you to explain this to me," said Tyson, throwing a folder on the table. Alan looked at the documents, and for a moment, his expression faltered. But he quickly regained his composure, crossing his arms and leaning back in his chair. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't you know?" Tyson took a step forward, the anger in his voice evident. Unauthorized transfers of funds, contracts that exactly coincide with the conglomerate's movements. This is no coincidence, Alan. The man laughed, but it was an empty sound. Tyson, you're seeing ghosts where there are none. So explain this to me, Tyson replied, pointing to a printed email that detailed a communication between Alan and Luke. Alan was silent, but his face turned visibly pale. Look, it's not what it seems, he began, but Tyson raised his hand, interrupting him. I don't need your apology, Alan. You betrayed my trust, put Ava in danger, and risked everything we've built. Alan tried to respond, but Tyson had already made his decision. He called his security team, asking them to escort Alan out of the building. Hours later, Tyson returned to Bean and Hearth, finding Ava at the counter. She was serving a customer, but as soon as she saw him, she realized something had changed. And then, she asked, as soon as the customer left. Resolved, he said, sitting down on one of the stools. Ava smiled, feeling a wave of relief. We're almost there, Tyson. Thanks to you, he replied, looking at her with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. They knew that the battle was not over yet, but at that moment, they felt that they were stronger than ever. The morning sun invaded the Bean and Hearth as a promise of new beginnings. Golden rays streamed through the large windows, creating patterns of light on the polished wooden floor. The tables, decorated with small vases of fresh flowers in shades of white and yellow, seemed to frame the environment with an air of discreet celebration. The aroma of freshly roasted coffee mixed with the sweet smell of croissants and muffins coming out of the oven, embracing each person in the space like an invitation to stay. Behind the counter, Ava was more radiant than ever. His posture, once bowed by the weight of worries, was now erect and confident. The features on her face, softened by relief, carried a genuine smile that she could barely contain. The cafe was packed, pulsing with life and lively conversation. Old customers had returned, and new faces mingled with them. There was something magical about that day, something that seemed to scream victory and hope from every corner. She watched the customers with bright eyes, taking in the scene around her. It was as if the fight had finally been worth it. After months of uncertainty and sleepless nights, the Bean and Hearth not only survived, but thrived. The community campaign hadn't just saved the cafe, had brought back the essence of what he meant to Ava and everyone who walked through those doors. The doorbell rang, bringing a cool breeze and a moment of silence before conversations resumed. Ava looked up and saw him. Tyson walked in, and for a moment, it seemed like time had slowed down. He wore a black leather jacket over a light blue shirt, which highlighted his broad shoulders and the intense sparkle in his blue eyes. The dark jeans he wore seemed molded to him, and there was a quiet confidence in every step he took, a reflection of the battles they'd overcome together. Tyson looked around the cafe, but his eyes only stopped when they met Ava's. It was a look full of meaning that said things that words couldn't. Ava felt her heart race, a reaction she couldn't control. I didn't want to control. Good morning, Ava, he said, with a smile that seemed designed to brighten up the already sun-drenched space even more. She returned the smile, her voice coming out with a sweetness that she could no longer hide. Good morning, Tyson. He approached the counter, leaning slightly towards her. The way he did this seemed to reduce the distance between them, and also the weeks of tension and uncertainty they had overcome. It's busier than ever, he commented, his eyes scanning the full cafe. Thanks to you, Ava replied, as she grabbed a mug to fill with his favorite coffee. Tyson raised an eyebrow, a hint of teasing in his smile. No, thanks to us, he corrected, his voice full of sincerity. She placed the mug in front of him, and for an instant, the world around him seemed to disappear. They looked at each other, as if that moment belonged only to them. There was an intensity in Tyson's eyes that made her feel like he was about to say something important, something that would change everything. Before she could speak, Molly rushed in, calling Ava to help her with a large order. Ava looked at Tyson, as if silently apologizing, and followed Molly with a smile that had not yet disappeared. As she worked, Tyson watched her from where he was. He felt a rush of gratitude and admiration as he watched her smile and interact with people. Ava was different. She had a strength he had rarely found in anyone, a resilience that inspired him. She made him want to be better, want to fight, not just for her, but for himself. When Ava finally returned, Tyson was standing next to the counter, holding something small in his hands. His fingers wrapped the object carefully, as if it were something precious. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice lower than usual, full of emotion. Ava frowned, intrigued, but nodded. Tyson gestured to a table near the window, where sunlight softly bathed the seats. They sat down, and Ava noticed something different about him. Despite his usual confidence, there was a nervousness there, evident in the way he ran his hand through his hair, slightly messing up the strands. He took a deep breath before starting to speak. "Ava, when I first walked into this cafe, it was broke, in ways I couldn't even understand at the time. I thought I was in control of my life, but I was just surviving, running away from my past and everything that had gone wrong." She opened her mouth to say something, but he raised his hand, a small smile softening his expression. "Let me finish. You changed that. This place changed that. You showed me that I am not just my past, that I can be more, fight for more." He reached into his pocket and took out a small blue velvet box. Ava felt the air disappear for a moment. He opened it, revealing an elegant ring with a small diamond that caught the sunlight and sparkled with perfect simplicity. "I want to fight for you, Ava. For us. I want this cafe, this place that brought our lives together, to also be the beginning of our future." He stood up and, without hesitation, knelt before her. The entire cafe fell silent, the people around them stopping their conversations and turning their eyes towards them. "Ava, you taught me not to run away anymore, to face life with courage. You are everything I didn't know I needed, and I want to spend each day showing you how much you mean to me. Will you agree to marry me?" The words resonated in the air, filling the silence with palpable emotion. Ava felt the tears welling up, but they were tears of happiness, of relief, of something she knew she would never forget. She nodded, her voice choked but full of conviction. "Yes, Tyson, of course I accept." The cafe erupted in applause and cheers as Tyson took the ring and slipped it gently onto Ava's finger. When they stood up, he wrapped her in a tight hug, holding her as if he never wanted to let go. The woodsy scent of his cologne mixed with the aroma of coffee in the air, and Ava felt the heat of his body against hers. It was a heat that seemed to erase any shadow of doubt or fear. "I love you, Ava," Tyson said, his voice low but firm. "I love you too, Tyson," she replied, smiling against his chest. In that moment, between the smell of coffee, the sunlight and the warm palms around her, Ava knew that the bean and hearth, it wasn't just where he found his strength. It was where she found love and a future she had never dared to dream of. The comforting aroma of fresh coffee mixed with the light scent of flowers scattered in small vases that adorned the tables in the room. Bean and hearth, every detail seemed to tell a story. The golden rays of the sun streaming through the windows, the dancing patterns of light on the wooden floor, the peaceful smiles of the customers filling the cafe. The instrumental music that filled the room was like a rhythmic beat for Ava's heart, which, behind the counter, moved with the grace and lightness of someone who had won important battles. Her hair was tied up in an elegant bun, but a few stubborn strands escaped, framing her face flushed from the morning heat and constant movement. In her eyes there was something new, a gleam of hope and accomplishment that made her smile even more radiant. Ava was delivering a cappuccino to a regular customer, but her eyes never stopped scanning the space around her. Every conversation, every laugh echoing through the room, seemed like a reminder of everything she and Tyson had overcome to get there. The sweet smell of apple pies mingled with the aroma of freshly baked bread, creating a feeling of home that seemed to welcome everyone. The cafe was busier than ever, a symbol of the new era that Ava had helped to build. Since the victory against the conglomerate, the bean and hearth that had become more than a cafe, it was a meeting point for the community, a place where stories crossed paths and dreams were renewed. Across the cafe, Tyson was sitting with a group of small business owners, laughing at something one of them had said. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and his dark pants complemented his relaxed but still markedly confident stance. He seemed perfectly at ease, but as always, his presence exuded authority and charisma. When his eyes met Ava's, time seemed to slow down. Tyson smiled, that particular smile that made Ava's heart race. She returned it with a look that said more than any words. a silent moment that only the two of them understood. After saying goodbye to the businessmen, Tyson walked to the counter. He leaned lightly, watching Ava as she finished a cappuccino, creating a delicate heart art with the foam. "How is the love of my life today?" he asked, his voice low and full of tenderness, enough to make her smile involuntarily. "The love of your life is doing great, thank you," Ava replied, trying to keep her tone casual. But the warmth in her voice was unmistakable. "And you? Better now that I'm here with you." There was an ease in their interactions that made Ava feel safer than ever. But before she could respond, Molly appeared with a conspiratorial smile and a black folder with the logo of the new foundation Ava and Tyson had created. "Are you ready for the big announcement?" asked Molly, her eyes shining with excitement. Ava looked at Tyson, who nodded, and together they headed to the small makeshift stage in the corner of the cafe. Conversation subsided when customers began to turn around, curious, while the music in the room was turned down. "Good morning, everyone," began Ava, her voice clear and confident, but full of emotion. "This cafe has always been more than a place to drink coffee. It is a home, a symbol of resistance and everything we can achieve when we are together." The murmurs of approval grew, and Ava felt the crowd's support like a boost. "Today, Tyson and I are thrilled to announce the creation of the Bean and Hearth Foundation. Our mission is to support small businesses and local merchants, helping others fight for their dreams, just like you helped us fight for ours." The applause that filled the cafe was deafening, full of enthusiasm and gratitude. Ava looked at Tyson, who took the microphone with a confident smile. "This coffee taught me a lot, but the biggest lesson was that no one wins alone. Each of you is part of this story, and now we want to help other people write theirs. Thank you for believing in us." When the applause finally subsided, Ava and Tyson walked off the stage, hands clasped in a silent promise. As customers returned to their lively conversations, Ava felt a deep sense of relief, a sense of purpose that made all the effort worth it. Later, with the sun setting and the sky painted orange and pink, the cafe began to empty. Tyson, with a mischievous gleam in his eyes, connected his cell phone to the cafe's sound system and played some soft music. Ava, who was cleaning one of the tables, looked up in surprise. "What are you doing?" she asked, laughing when she saw his expression. "Asking my wife to dance," Tyson replied, extending his hand to her. For a moment, Ava hesitated, but then she smiled and placed her hand in his, letting herself be guided to the center of the cafe. Tyson held her firmly, but with a gentleness that made her feel as if she were floating. His hand rested on her waist, while Ava placed her hands on his shoulders, feeling the familiar warmth of his body against hers. The music enveloped them, and the world around them seemed to disappear. Ava closed her eyes for a moment, resting her head on Tyson's chest, listening to the rhythmic sound of his heart. The woodsy smell of his cologne mixed with the aroma of coffee that still hung in the air, and she smiled, feeling complete. "Can you believe we're here now?" Ava asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Yes," Tyson replied, without hesitation, "because that's exactly where we were supposed to be." When she looked up at him, Tyson leaned over and kissed her. It was a soft kiss, but full of meaning, a silent celebration of everything they had built together. When the song ended, they stood still for a moment, enveloped in the soft light of the cafe's lamps. There was a gleam in Tyson's eyes that promised more than just love. It promised a future of partnership, understanding, and shared dreams. The Bean and Hearth, it had started out as Ava's dream, but now it was so much more. It was a symbol of resilience, of community, and most of all, of the love that she and Tyson had found and would continue to build day after day.